It's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off the cages loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 10 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. So this week, we will be reviewing three articles I wrote this week on Substack. The first is, are the Philippines changing tactics? The second is, Russia and the West issue more threats. And the final is a new series I called is the West Philippine Sea Newsletter Volume 1. So that's something new that looking at is going an ongoing series. We'll see how it performs. Just as concentration has been the week, that's a common topic. It's an important topic to me, and so I wanted to put a dedicated lineup, put a dedicated paper in the weekly lineup for the time being. So we'll discuss that. So first is, are the Philippines changing tactics? So after the incident in April between the Chinese and Filipino Coast Guards in the Scarborough Shoal, that's the one where the Chinese Coast Guard used water cannons against a Philippine Coast Guard ship and a fishery agency ship, which is the first time that the Chinese had used water cannons against government ships. So the question is, are the Philippines changing tactics in their EEZ, as stated by Secretary of National Defense Gilbert Teodoro shortly after that event at the Scarborough Shoal? So what I talked about is that the Philippine Coast Guard and Philippine Fishery, let's see if I get the name right, Philippine Fishery Development Authority vessel were patrolling the Scarborough Shoal when they were confronted by four Chinese Coast Guard ships who used water cannons against both ships, two water cannon assaults on the Philippine Coast Guard ship and one on the Philippine Fishery Development ship. No injuries, fortunately, but there was damage to both ships. It was the first time that this had ever been used against Philippine government ships, and that initiated Defense Secretary Teodoro's call to change tactics, or the Philippines to change their tactics. So we don't know what that meant. So now we're just kind of watching the developments in the West Philippine Sea and seeing if there's any indications of changing, where before they were announcing, meaning the Philippines were announcing resupply missions to the Second Thomas Shoal or going to the Scarborough Shoal, Escoda Shoal. Now, so is there going to be a change in these tactics? I think Secretary Teodoro had even said that the Philippines were telegraphing too much and letting the Chinese get being prepared to counter the Philippine arrival to various shoals, mainly the Second Thomas Shoal and the Sierra Madre. So the first indication happened at the Escoda Shoal. China is apparently attempting to build an artificial island in the shoal. This is very similar to some of the other artificial islands that China has built throughout the South China Sea. The Philippines detected some Chinese ships operating in the area and sent ships and aircraft of their own to monitor the situation. The Philippine investigation found crushed coral in the reef, which is the same construction technique that the Chinese used in their other artificial islands by using crushed coral to build up the seabed to make it above sea level, even in high tide. So the Escoda Shoal is 75 miles from the Palawan Island, and that is part of one of the islands that is part of the main Philippine island chain. The Philippines cannot allow an artificial island so close to the Philippine main islands. It would have inhibit free access in territorial waters and serve to block access to the EEZ, especially the Second Thomas Shoal. It would also block the Philippines' access to energy fields in the Reed Bank. Now, remember this, since this area is within the the Philippine EEZ. They have the rights to the natural resources, fishing, gas, and oil in those regions. So, the Philippines' attempt to develop that energy field in the West Philippine Sea and the Reed Bank would be blocked or severely inhibited if the Chinese had built a fake or an artificial island in the Escoda Shoal. So this is where the change of tactic comes in. So the Philippine Coast Guard sent 3 vessels, including its largest Coast Guard vessel, to maintain a constant presence in the area to keep the Chinese away. So there's no permanent settlement like the Scarborough Shoal. There's no permanent settlement on this island or on the shoal. So they have to keep a presence through ships in the area. So the use of the largest Coast Guard vessel to maintain a constant presence is telling. And this is because many of the Chinese Coast Guard ships are, I would say retired, but mainly repurposed People Liberation Army Navy ships that have been, most of their vertical, or actually all their vertical weapons have been removed, though the launchers are still there, or in these ships. So these have been repurposed from People Liberation Army Navy ships to Coast Guard ships. And since these are former warships, they tend to have a greater displacement than the Philippine vessels that they encounter in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea. This means because they have greater displacement, they can successfully ram smaller Philippine ships with little threat to harm themselves. Now the Philippines have put their largest Coast Guard ship, which would mean that the ramming tactics would not likely work, or it could cause much more severe damage to the Chinese Coast Guard ships. The Philippines are also sending out a team to investigate to collect evidence on a potential maritime claim. The purpose that the investigation is, they're going to try to find out where the crushed coral came from. So this could be presented to evidence to a maritime court if they choose to go that direction. Why this is important is that they can determine is if it's something that's from the Escoda Shoal or coral from the Escoda Shoal, it would be a little harder for the Philippines to argue. But if it came from another shoal or another seabed outside of the Escoda Shoal, it becomes a much more easier demonstration that the Philippines can show before the international community and international court that the coral was placed there by most likely China, because they do have a history of doing that, and there is a history of disputing. China is not disputing what's in the EEZ. They just claim the whole area of the South China Sea as their own. The second indication is that the Scarborough Shoal of a change of tactics. The Philippine NGO, non-government organization called Atenito, which means this is ours, organized a flotilla to sail to the disputed shoal. The goal and we talked about this last week, the goal was to conduct a 3-day mission with the official purpose to provide food and diesel fuel to Philippine fishermen around the shoal. These fishermen are often harassed by the Chinese Coast Guard and the Chinese Maritime Militia. So it did serve as a humanitarian gesture. Atenito on Wednesday, May 15th, with 200 volunteers and 100 fishermen organized in 5 wooden bancas, set sail from the main Philippine islands. This was escorted by 100 Philippine fishing boats, though not all of them made the journey. Most of it was goodwill towards the mission of Atenito. The Philippine government did not participate, but they did send a Coast Guard vessel to follow the flotilla, and an aircraft, I believe, of the Philippine Coast Guard, was also monitored the situation with the official Philippine government position that it was there to protect Philippine citizens from overt actions from the Chinese. There were some volunteers the main purpose was to film and catalog the event, just like many of the other activities that the Philippines have been doing in the disputed shoals in the West Philippine Sea. Is they have been sending reporters, people to document, people to take video of what is going on in the shoals, so that they can show the world what China is up to in a area of the world that is legally belongs to the Philippines for their own economic development. Now, Atenito did send a small advance team from ahead of the main flotilla, and they succeeded in entering the Scarborough Shoal and delivered supplies that was distributed to 36 Philippine fishing boats that counted for 144 Philippine fishermen. Now, this successful delivery of provisions was twofold. It was a humanitarian gesture to support the Philippine fishermen that faced daily harassment from the Chinese, mainly from the maritime militia, secondarily from the Chinese Coast Guard. Many of these tactics is that the Chinese government leaves it up to the maritime militia to do much of its harassment work, though the Chinese Coast Guard is not innocent in this either. It has also been able to breach the Chinese blockade around the shoal. So Atenito was able to breach this blockade. The Chinese had deployed one Navy ship from the People's Liberation Army, 8 Coast Guard ships, 34 maritime militia ships around the shoal. So this was a serious attempt by the Chinese to block access to Atenito. Obviously, Atenito had announced that this event to the Scarborough Shoal was going to happen. So the Chinese started deploying more resources into the shoal, even though they do maintain a permanent, although illegal, it's international waters that they can sail through, but obviously they're there to harass any Philippine elements inside the Philippines EEZ. So they did send more ships to meet Atenito, and what Atenito had done was sent a advance team that was a base. I think it sailed one full day ahead of the main flotilla, and it was able to get into a position where it was able to penetrate the so-called blockade of the Chinese ships before they could properly set up. The Chinese government did react to the incursion by authorizing its Coast Guard to arrest any, quote, foreigners, end quote, trespassing in its claimed territorial waters. This order was issued after the Philippine group, that advanced party, had penetrated to the shoal, and no attempted arrests were made after the incident. The threat of arrest was meant to discourage any future returns of the Philippine civilians, and it does not officially go into effect until June 1st. The punishment is 60 days in Chinese jail with no trial. It is, we will talk about that later on in this book with the West Philippine Sea Volume 1. So this was a serious attempt, and obviously the Chinese government was embarrassed by this, and that's when they issued the arrest policy starting on June 1st. So the question is, was this a blockade? Now, there was a large presence of Chinese ships in the region, more than normal, but there's always a presence of Chinese ships in the region. And this was due to Atenito had telegraphed that they were going to sail to the Scarborough Shoal. And the Chinese do claim that this is not a blockade. It's a matter of interpretation. So the interpretation and use of blockade is, again, it's being loosely used depending on what side it's coming from. China says it's not a blockade because it can't be a blockade because the whole South China Sea, which includes the West Philippine Sea, is their own territory, so they cannot blockade their own territory. The Chinese Communist Party, claims they are protecting its territory from foreigners who are violating its sovereignty. The Philippines, on the other side, call it a blockade because the number of ships used to block is the number of ships that are being used to block its ability to get to the shoal, which is part of its exclusive economic zone. They have all the international legal rights to be here. So why this matters is, and it might be a minor point, but when you start using the word blockade, it actually does have a legal term. A blockade is an act of war according to the 1856 Paris Declaration respecting maritime law and Article 1 through 22 of the 1909 London Declaration concerning the laws of naval warfare. Now, why does this matter to the Philippines? Well, the Philippines' argument and why they went to the UN court on the laws of the sea and won twice against the Chinese, which the Chinese do not listen to, is the Philippine government is claiming that they are acting under the legal provisions of the law. So they are acting in accordance of international law when they make their claims within the exclusive economic zone of the South China Sea. Again, I'll reiterate how this fluctuates. Officially, when you look at maps, the South China Sea is the main body of water, but the Philippine government, and I think this is a clever, smart move on their behalf, is anything that is in this exclusive economic zone of the Philippines in the South China Sea has been redesignated by the Philippine government as the West Philippine Sea. So the West Philippine Sea is part of the South China Sea that includes the Philippine legally recognized EEZ. So the position of the Philippine government is that they are acting within the international law of the seas. And again, they do have backings of 2 findings against the Chinese government and in the Philippines' behalf. So they are enacting in accordance to of maritime law, and a blockade is an act of war. So, but having said that, no power in the region is willing to challenge China to go to war over an uninhabited shoal in the EEZ, even if it's called a blockade and acts as a de facto or actual blockade. So nobody's willing to go to war over this. So this is probably more of my point, is when they start using the term blockade, there is an actual meaning behind that. That's a legal term. Now, there might be some differentiations after some previous laws after, again, these treaties are well over 100 years old, but have largely stood the test of time. Why do you wonder why when we, during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, I believe it was October 62, the reason why it was called a quarantine is because if they used the term blockade, that was an act of war. So when you use the term blockade, there is an actual legal meaning behind it. Now, again, nobody's willing to go to war over this de facto blockade in the EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. And that would certainly be different if it was in the Philippine territorial waters. Just something to be aware of, that term blockade actually does have meaning. And when it's said as a blockade, it is an accusation of sorts. And the Chinese use it as a denial that it can't be a blockade because they are the sovereign owners, in their words, of the South China Sea. The Chinese are also using their maritime militia to do most of the blocking and harassing, and the Chinese claim that they are civilians and not military and outside of government control. So even if it was a blockade, these are private individuals, privateers, I guess you could say. Privateers also is a loaded sea term. I'm probably not the best nautical person to discuss that, but privateer actually does mean something in international law, maritime law as well. So, but this is just another technicality that the Chinese are using to obfuscate the mission in the shoals, of saying, well, it's not a blockade because it's territory, and even if it was a blockade, these are private individuals and not part of the government. But this is a technicality because the maritime militia is hired by, contracted for work at the direction of various levels of the CCP, from the national party to some of the local parties. So interesting is NATO is performing the same function as the Chinese maritime militia performs, and that's kind of sitting in that maritime gray zone tactics. So just to reiterate, gray zone tactics are tactics, this seems so obvious, gray zone is the tactics between war and peace. And they are used to create conditions favorable to one side, whether creating a situation to create a military advantage, maybe a casus belli to create conditions to justify military force against a smaller power. It can also be used to find a way to paralyze a larger power that doesn't want to attack, quote, civilians. So they are an integral part of Chinese Communist Party and Communist Party tactics in general, is using these types of gray zones, these blurring lines between military and civilian. So why I talk about NATO is acting like in that Chinese gray zone tactics is it's turning Chinese tactics against the Chinese, who are the larger power. It puts itself, NATO puts itself in harm's way, knowing that any reaction by the Chinese that caused the death of a Philippine citizen would be a serious escalation. And I say this because in mid-April, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. stated that any death of a Philippine citizen could trigger the U.S. Defense Pact with the Philippines. The Philippine Coast Guard, as I mentioned earlier, was observing NATO from the sea and the air with the stated goal to protect its citizens. So the purpose kind of goes back to what some of the statements coming from President Marcos. So this seems to be another indication that there is another change of tactics. We have what's going on in the Skoda Shoal, and then how they're approaching sending at NATO went on their own, but then the government was also backing, looking for any type of escalation on behalf of the Chinese. The Chinese have to be aware of this as well. That they are kind of, if they go overboard in their tactics, it could create an international incident. So, is the intent of NATO in the Philippines to challenge China to force it to back down to avoid a situation that could kill a Philippine citizen and risk escalation that would not only be with the Philippines, but it would also be with the U.S. and most likely Japan? So China has to be aware of this. When they react to NATO, and now they're talking about arrests, what is the risk if a Philippine citizen is killed in the West Philippine Sea? It is unclear if the use of NATO to break the China attempts to block the access to disputed waters a tactic change that Secretary Teodoro was referencing, or if it will be used again. It had been used before in the Scarborough Shoal during the Christmas season to run resupply out there to Philippine fishermen as well. So it's not the first time that's being used, but in the context of Secretary Teodoro saying that they were going to change tactics, it does bring in the question, is this a tactic change, and can we expect more actions by NATO to operate in that gray zone tactic to basically dare the Chinese to risk a larger escalation? Now, I don't think that's the intent. I think that's try to force China have a moment of pause and how aggressive they're trying to enforce what's going on in the West Philippine Sea. So the questions I had of here finally was, it is a challenge by the Philippines not to give up its rights to disputed shoals in the West Philippine Sea. So again, the Philippines is clearly the smaller country, but they do have the backing of the United States. So the Philippines are not simply giving up their claims by abandoning the region to China. That's important because if the Philippines just say, okay, throw their hands up, and this is really a Chinese tactic, just pressure to finally that they just give up, like these smaller countries just give up. So I don't even want to challenge China. It's not, it's dangerous. It's something that they don't want, that the threat to China, both economically and militarily, is too much for a smaller country to bear. But remember, the Philippines have the backing of the United States and Japan. So it does have some economic background to fall upon. It also has those defense alliances with the United States, and it does have some defense alliances with Japan. So it has something to fall back on that you don't normally see some of the smaller countries like Brunei, who also has issues with China in the South China Sea. So it's a real challenge. So this is a scenario. It's a real challenge for China because if it acts aggressively or too aggressively against unarmed civilian ships and light boats, like Atnito did when they sent the 5 Pacas up to the Scarborough Shoal, these would most not likely stand up to water cannon assaults. Remember, the Chinese Coast Guard ships were damaged by the water cannon assaults. It would be no stretch of the imagination that these smaller bancas would not be able to stand up to a water cannon assault, and it could kill or seriously injure a Philippine national. That's something that China has to be aware of. If that happens, a Philippine citizen is injured or killed, it risks triggering a showdown with the U.S., and that would be in a region that China would not want to fight a naval war. So the escalation cycle continues to press as the Philippines continue to press China on their legal claims. Now we have this threat of arrests by the Chinese against Philippine citizens. So it'll be interesting to see starting next week. I think it's not. I guess it would be next week to see if the Chinese follow through with that. And it'll be interesting to see because I'll talk about it later, that is a red line for the Philippines as well. So a little bit more in the other article, because this week, just the way the days fell, is there's actually 2 articles this week on the Philippines challenges in the West Philippine Sea. So talk a little bit more about the Philippines later. Let's just take a break and let's go back to Russia and the West issue more threats. So the question is, what new round of policies is being debated or implemented as both sides, Russia and the West, attempt to change their fortunes and create a favorable position in the war as this war enters its 3rd year? So the Russian spring offensive is now underway. It's clear that is happening. Russia is estimated to have 500,000 soldiers in Ukraine. When I say soldiers, that also, from my understanding, that includes, it could include Marine units. So the Russian army launched an assault towards Kharkiv, the 2nd largest city in Ukraine, and it did make progress towards the city. The progress was stopped when the Ukrainians committed their reserves around the city, and it was able to stop the Russians. Though what's the evaluation of what was going on around Kharkiv is it was probably not the objective to seize the city, since it was a relatively small force committed compared to Russia's overall strength in Ukraine. The most likely purpose of the offensive is to probably the commitment of reserves, and it was also to push the Ukraine front back because the Kharkiv region faces across the border to Belgorod, which has been a Russian city that has been the target of a number of Ukrainian cross-border attacks, including drone attacks. Now, the concern is that Russia will attack multiple parts of the front in the spring and force Ukraine to commit its limited manpower reserves. Obviously, the Ukrainians do have manpower issues. That's been the population of Russia is 3.5 times greater than Ukraine, so that puts Ukraine at a great disadvantage when it comes to manpower. The other one is the Russian attacks of attacking multiple parts of the front to start stretching the Ukrainian lines and have them commit their reserves into other parts, which could have a result of thinning out parts of the line, also removing the defense in depth of having reserves, as further and further are being committed to counter the parries of the Russian military. Now, it's still early in the spring, but the spring strategy appears to be leveraging the Russian strengths and this of manpower strength. So again, they outnumber Ukraine 3.5 to 1 in raw population. So this Russian strength, again, they have 500,000 in the field in Ukraine. And so the Russians are leveraging their strength that coincides with the manpower shortage that the Ukrainians are experiencing. Now, the manpower issue in Ukraine, which has always been a problem, is that the Ukraine government delayed on a new draft law, which was passed in mid-May, which was actually the original law was supposed to be for a large-scale call-up. And that was debated for quite some time in Ukraine, and it was finally passed and signed into law in mid-May. This new law allows Ukraine to draft more men. Ukrainians have been trying to hold back too many young men from being drafted in the service. The concern is that they want to have a population that will allow the survival of the Ukrainian people. And their concern is, first off, Ukraine has a low birth rate, below replacement rate. If they lose too many males, the concern is they will not be able to, that will hurt the future of the Ukrainian population and culture. So they have been hesitant to draft younger men into the service. This new law, I think, will allow them to go down to drafting men the age of 25. There are some other stipulations. But the biggest impact of this delay is that they cannot start to bring in more manpower into the Ukrainian army, which the average age of the Ukrainian soldier is over 40 years old. The delay means that it will be late summer before these new recruits are armed and properly trained. And that is something that has to be considered because Ukraine needs to train these troops because it does not have the luxury of manpower reserves in their population like the Russians do to just throw them in the meat grinder. They need to preserve their strength, so just improperly training them for 3 to 4 weeks and throwing them in the front line is not in the Ukrainians' best interest. It would actually be better off to give more ground, in my opinion, than to throw away lives that they can't afford. So they obviously need manpower to counter the Russians, but they need these people to be properly trained, and it would be better to give up, in my opinion, ground than waste people's lives to counter the Russians. The delay in the law makes an already bad manpower situation in the Ukraine army worse. On top of that, Western aid had been delayed from both parts of Europe and the United States, but that Western aid that is arriving and will still take some more time to fully get there and have the full benefits of it. This aid cannot make up for the deficit of manpower on the Ukraine side. Manpower is a crucial issue, almost a crisis for the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian war effort. The Russian offensive may not, knowing this, the Russian offensive may not attempt to do a breakthrough. It doesn't have to have a breakthrough if it forces Ukraine to commit its reserves and thin its front. The Ukrainians, especially with their manpower issues, cannot be strong everywhere. The Ukraine may decide to commit all its reserves, move soldiers from other fronts, thus weakening them, those other fronts, or pull back to shorten its defensive lines, which can be dangerous if it's done under the threat of a Russian breakthrough. What this often reminds me of is the Russian tactics kind of remind me of twofold, is during World War II, where the Red Army would do these counterpunches where they would attack in multiple fronts as one. They would keep switching the offensive direction. They would attack in the north, and then they would attack in the south, or they attack in the center, and then the south. And so they were always counterpunching and always keeping the German army off guard. It was also kind of reminded me of, as more and more reserves are committed and the Ukrainians might be forced to start thinning their fronts, kind of reminds me of Grant at Petersburg, where he was able to force Lee to cover ever larger parts of territory around Petersburg as the Union Army extended its line. The Confederates under Lee had to meet that extension, and eventually they had thinned their line to such a point that the Union Army was eventually to be able to make a breakthrough. So I kind of thought of that as a similar example to what we see in World War II and what we saw in the U.S. Civil War at Petersburg. So that's, as we see the offensive rolling out, it'll be interesting to see how the Ukrainians react, and if they do hold back their manpower long enough to fully train them. Also this week in TASS, a Russian newspaper, state newspaper, the Russian Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Ryabkov, in an interview also this month of May, stated that the U.S. had long been in what he called an indirect war with Russia and had, quote, played, end quote, with Ukraine in such a way that it allowed the situation to get out of control, and it created the conditions that led to the Ukraine invasion. Now, what he means by played, he didn't specify, but I could probably guess, is part of it is U.S. interfering in Ukrainian politics before the invasion of 2022, well past the invasion of 2022, including playing it in presidential elections, maybe putting their hand on the scale of elections, NATO expansion to Ukraine, offering Ukraine a chance to join NATO. This removed the buffer zone between the West and Russia, which has been policy for the Soviet Union and Russia, that there had to be a buffer zone of states between Russia and the West, because Russia, the Soviet Union, had twice been invaded by the West in World War I and World War II at a cost of probably over, I'm trying to think, it's probably about 35 million people between the two wars, just over 25 million in World War II, and I think it was just over 10 million in World War I, though that might be including some of the Russian Civil War that started just after the Russians dropped out of World War I. So the buffer zone has been an important part of Russian security and Soviet security since the end of World War II, where they pledged they would never again be vulnerable to a Western invasion that cost the Soviet Union or Russia so many lives. This does not justify what Stalin had done as a dictator, but just kind of stating what Soviet Russian policy has been since 1945. It's funny that they wanted a buffer zone, but due to the invasion, it coincidentally that buffer zone was eliminated when Finland joined NATO. Finland has a long border with Russia. So by them enacting them, the Russians, by invading Ukraine, had created a situation that Finland could join the war. And now, even if, let's say, Ukraine becomes a permanently neutral state and doesn't join NATO or the EU, not saying that's going to happen, but it's a what if, it doesn't matter because now NATO is on the Russian frontier in the Baltics. So the other thing is that all this had happened is the buffer zone and the expansion of Ukraine, the loss of the buffer zone with the expansion of Ukraine, U.S. interfering in Ukraine politics to pull it out of the Russian sphere of influence, is, according to Ryabkov, is this forced Russia's hand and it had to act, and that had to act led to the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Now, these accusations are not new, and I've written about them extensively, including critically about NATO expansion to Ukraine and the reckless disregard of Russian long-stated security requirements. Not saying that it's necessarily right, but we'll talk about here later about some of the Russian actions. But Ryabkov's accusations are not new, but this time he squarely blames the U.S. for the war, where before it was more of the West and NATO and not so much U.S. by name. But now it's like he squarely is blaming the U.S. for the war. Now, is that part of official policy? I have not seen Putin say that in such a direct manner, though I am sure he is of the same sentiment of Ryabkov. I don't see the Russians or the Putin administration allowing Ryabkov to say such things without being official, at least the belief within the Russian government. He also stated that Ryabkov had also stated that the U.S. had put itself in a position, and it's only because its actions up to this point have failed to stop Russia. So the U.S. had put itself in a position, and now its only response is to continue to provide ever greater support to Ukraine. Now, he makes this point. Again, he doesn't go into great detail, so this is a lot of speculation, or a fair amount of speculation, though I think you could draw inferences based on who this war has been going on in its third year. There's a lot of pointers in what led up to the war and what's gone on since the war. Is the U.S. does not have a roadmap for ending the war other than escalation, according to the deputy foreign minister. He also stated it is difficult for Russia to determine the policy of the U.S. in regards to Ukraine. So he talks about the ambiguity of trying to guess what the intentions of the U.S. and NATO are. But that's part of standard strategic ambiguity where you're not supposed to telegraph what you're going to do. But they are complaining that they can't read what the U.S. intent is in Ukraine. So he made this claim that Russia will remove all red lines for the West and said that Russia would mirror the Western behavior. Now, my belief, again, he's not stating the reason why, but a hot debate that's coming up in the West right now in NATO countries is, I think Ryabkov is warning the U.S., the United Kingdom, and France, who are all pushing for the removal of restrictions of Western weapons not to be used against targets inside Russia. So I think that this is a warning that if the West crosses this, quote, red line, end quote, it will force Russia to mirror the response of the West. What does that mean? Not sure, but again, Ryabkov complains about strategic ambiguity and not being able to read what the West is doing. He is providing his own strategic ambiguity in itself by making this statement. And also by stating that, he's kind of putting his own red line, which he said he was going to remove, and that Russia would mirror what the West was doing. So a lot of this is double speak, for lack of a better word. So this is not to say that just this is just the Russia statements from the foreign ministry and the start of the spring offensive. The U.S. and the G7 and its G7 allies are also active in that they are discussing the seizure of Russian financial assets to support the war in Ukraine. Now, after the war, $300 billion in assets of Russia were frozen in financial institutions in the West. There was some smaller seizures in Russia of Western assets, mainly, I think, around airlines, but is of a much smaller amount than the $300 billion of assets sitting in the West. The U.S. position is they want to seize those assets and use them for the war in Ukraine. The European Union states that seizing these assets is illegal, but agrees that the interest from the assets should be used to support the war, while the assets themselves will remain untouched and just in a frozen state. This issue will be discussed by the G7 when they meet in Italy in mid-June, though it's unsure if a decision will be fully made by then. Now, whether you're seizing the assets or the proceeds from these, the interest or dividends, this would allow the U.S. to bypass congressional oversight and the EU's requirement of unanimous consent. So this does lift some of the debate and the policy questions of the West if they do use these assets to help fund the war, whether the assets or the interest rates. Now, this action itself, other than helping the West fund the war, would not change Russia's ability to prosecute the war. These funds are already frozen. Russia doesn't have access, and they've been able to prosecute the war without them. So this does not have any effect in ending the war. It is strictly a punitive measure against the oligarchs who are often viewed as Putin allies and supporters. Maybe this could pressure them to pressure Putin to end the war, but that hasn't worked so far. It's doubtful that it would even work this time around. Now, if, again, no approval debates would be needed if the U.S. and EU were to take these funds, they would not have to do any type of policy debates, and they can just continue on in their 2022 objectives of regime change. So, again, seizing these assets does remove a lot of the moderate effects of within the U.S. and the European Union, where funding and authorization has to be debated. So by seizing these assets, it removes a lot of these requirements of both the EU and the U.S. Now, the drawback of these seizures, if you didn't think that not having to debate policy within Ukraine in the form of aid is not a drawback, and I do consider that a drawback. So the drawback of asset seizures is it is likely illegal in the U.S. Interest seizures are probably also illegal. Both would hurt foreign investment in the U.S. and the EU and create criticism of both. Oftentimes, the U.S. and the EU claim that they are rule-based societies. They believe in the rule of law, and if they seize these assets, they are not acting in the rule of law. So the end is that you do not want to invest in the U.S. or the EU if your assets can be seized because you are on the wrong side of a political dispute that may not involve you. Now, why that's important is many of these oligarchs who left their money in the West had nothing to do with the war. These are, yes, they're politically connected people within Russia, but they are not in the government for the most part. Some maybe used to be in the government. Some of them may have made their billions while in the government. But most are not in the government. They had no way to influence foreign policy and certainly didn't make a decision to invade Ukraine. So somehow they're going to just seize their assets. Again, this is just a punitive measure against what the West views as Russian allies or Russian oligarchs who are allied with President Putin of Russia. So if you do take these assets, what kind of message does that send to the world that if you are, I don't know, let's say a Taiwanese billionaire that has money inside the U.S. and China takes over Taiwan, and now all of a sudden your assets are frozen, even though you had nothing to do with the war. So it's just bad precedent like these, where private citizens of a foreign country could have their assets seized, possibly sold off, and they had nothing to do with the war. It is not a good way if you're to be a rule-based society and promote the idea of rule of law, and you can just simply seize investments from somebody just so happens because they are, in this case, Russian. You have money in the bank in the West and you're Russian, that somehow that means you're guilty by association by the fact that you are Russian and you will lose your assets. Change Russian to any other nationality and it starts becoming, what is the problem with this policy? So the EU is probably more right than the US in this case, but it doesn't mean they're right either. I understand the sentiment if you're wanting to help the Ukrainians, but the fact is this will not change the war effort at all from the Russian perspective in their ability to fight the war, and it will just be a way to punish people through association of being, in this case, Russian. Now, it seems like I'm talking a lot about favoritism of Ryabkov's interview with TASS. And I'm certainly not, because his interview needs to be taken with a lot of skepticism. The war in Ukraine is not some novel new type of war called indirect war. There's nothing novel about it. This is a proxy war. Just like Afghanistan, when the U.S. supported the Mujahideen against the Russians in their war in the 80s, it actually started in the 70s in Afghanistan. And it's what the USSR, the Soviet Union, did in Korea and Vietnam during those wars when the U.S. involvement. Russia also interfered in the internal affairs just as the U.S. did in Ukraine. They are not innocent of this. So again, can't believe everything that he's saying. Again, he's just arguing his government's point of view. Doesn't mean that he is speaking the truth. Or is he being an honest broker in this discussion? Communication with the U.S. has been reduced. So this Ryabkov is correct in this since 2016, and has it made it hard for either side to know each other's intent, both before the Ukraine invasion and the events leading to the Ukraine invasion. There was the policy communication between the two countries was at a low. For example, Jeff Sessions, Senator Jeff Sessions, had to recuse himself when he was appointed as the Attorney General of the U.S. because he had contacts with the Russian ambassador when he was part of the Senate, I think the Senate International Affairs Committee, which in that role you would be expected to meet with foreign dignitaries and representatives from a foreign country, even an adversarial one like Russia. Those were those types of communications, those back channel ways of communicating, way to show intent, were severely curtailed as one's loyalty to the country could be questioned if you had any type of these type of communications, even if they were a part of your capacity of your job. So we did see a severe curtailment of communication between the Russia and the U.S. Since 2016. And then the other one I talked about earlier, the red line, the idea of Ryabkov that's saying that they're removing their red lines and they would mirror is just another red line in itself. So again, nothing new. It seemed like a lot of flowery language and buzzwords and trying to find some way to justify his position without being a honest broker. Means that, yes, anything he said needed to be taken with a grain of salt, even if there was some legitimate points to be made in his discussion. Again, a big grain of salt. Now, this kind of goes back to what I talked about last week. As Major General Vadim Skibitsky, the Deputy Chief of Ukraine Military Intelligence Directorate, stated in 2024 he stated that 2024 would be a year that both sides of the conflict would be attempting to get the most favorable battlefield position prior to any serious peace talks happening. As the Russian spring offensive, which is underway, and the summer offensive unfold and Western aid starts to arrive, it will be a wait and see of which side gets the upper hand on the battlefield that, in Skibitsky's point of view, will determine how a final negotiated settlement will look like for Ukraine. He is stating that a negotiated settlement is what will end this war. And I think he is correct in this matter. It doesn't look like the Ukrainians are going to collapse. They will have enough foreign aid to arrive. And then go back to the French statement that they would send more troops if a Russian breakthrough happens and the Ukrainian government requests that assistance. Again, go back to last week about some of the questions of how the French could do that. So Skibitsky's point of view is right. How 2024 unfolds, and we'll probably have to wait, unfortunately, through most of 2024 to see where this goes. There are peace talks scheduled for the month of June in Switzerland, which are not really peace talks at all because the Russians, as a party to the war, are not invited, and there's no representative, not even the Chinese, of the Russian point of view or the Russian position. So these are not really peace talks at all. But again, I talked about that as well in previous conversations. So the final paper is a new paper that I wrote, or a new series that I'm writing. Is I do write about the West, what's going on in the Philippines against the Chinese government. So I've decided to call what's called the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 1. I thought it would be more popular, but it has, we'll just say it hadn't set the world on fire. So we'll see how it goes. And if it's not any real demand for it, I will probably replace it. There's, unfortunately, a lot of things in the world to be discussed. But I do think this is a highly relevant situation in the Western Pacific. And again, what the Philippines are doing is a classic example of how a smaller power with competent leadership and the appropriate security guarantees from the United States and Japan has been able to consternate a larger power in the Chinese. So again, a highly educational situation that's going on in the West Philippine Sea. So the question for this newsletter was, the Philippines have refused to be intimidated into compliance or silenced by the Chinese threats over operating in the West Philippine Sea. So the situation in the West Philippine Sea is in an escalation cycle as China and the Philippines continue to press their claims. Now, this goes into what I said earlier in the earlier paper. China claims sovereignty over the entire South China Sea on dubious claims. So they say they have some historic claim over the South China Sea that goes back hundreds of years. So I saw this in a video, and I kind of remember, actually I saw it on X. I don't remember who said it, but imagine if the UK, it was from Task and Purpose on YouTube is what it was from. And so he made a quick, Cappy made a quick, the host, made a quick reference to the dubious claims of the South China Sea. Sometimes I think these guys copy me, but then again, I look at it as this is very popular throughout the world. So we just write about the same topics from a different point of view. So anyway, he made a quick quip is imagine if UK pulled out all the maps when they used to be the dominant power in the world, naval power in the world, and attempted to use the Chinese example of historic claims to make their own claims in the world. That wouldn't really go over. So that just tells you kind of the ridiculousness of the Chinese historic and dubious claims, which are not considered legal by international law. The Philippines have claims over the South China Sea in the West Philippine Sea. Again, the exclusive economic zone, the Philippines' exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea is referenced as the West Philippine Sea. And the Philippines' position is backed by international law. So we go back to Atenito. It is ours. An NGO was able to penetrate the Chinese blockade around the Scarborough Shoal, getting past a Navy ship, 8 Coast Guard ships, 10 maritime militia ships to deliver supplies for 144 fishermen. This was a public relation and a moral win for the Philippines, and it was an embarrassment to the CCP. And the Scarborough Shoal, where this occurred, is in the West Philippine Sea. So China's action against the Philippine Sea is illegal by international law. But the Chinese do not care about international law. They stick to their dubious historic claims, and they act undeterred. So when you go back to China's claims in the West Philippine Sea, they did not make these claims until they became an economic and military power as the sea lanes in the South China Sea became more lucrative as a trading route in the world. Also, when oil and gas deposits were discovered, this became very important in a country that does lack many of the natural resources to be energy independent. So all of a sudden they come up with this dubious historic claim when all of a sudden there is money to be made in claiming the South China Sea. So Atenito's success in the Scarborough Shoal has sparked a furious response from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. So as a petulant child that they can sometimes be, the Chinese government authorized the Chinese Coast Guard to arrest any, quote, foreigner, end quote, in the South China Sea who violated China's sovereign waters shortly, and they did this shortly after the incident, after they were already embarrassed, and this is how they acted out. They said punishment will be 60 days in prison in China with no trial. Now, if the Chinese go through with this threat, it would be a violation of international law, as the Philippines have exclusive jurisdiction in the EEZ. So this doesn't mean that there's no other actions that could be, like, for example, piracy can obviously be intervened with, naval distress. It is still international water, so freedom of navigation is still allowed. It's just that the EEZ means that Philippines have the authority to exploit the resources, the fishing, the oil, and the gas in the region, and not China. So if China goes through their threat to jail any foreigner violating its sovereign territory in the South China Sea, that would be a violation of international law, as again, exclusive jurisdiction is the Philippines in their EEZ. President Marcos Jr. condemned the threat and that it is not consistent with international law. And of course, that is correct. As we stated before, the Philippines' position has been twice certified by the Law of the Sea by the UN. So the spokesman for the Philippine Navy, Commodore Trinidad, stated that the Philippine Navy, would not allow the rest of its citizens. Now, what's unclear in this situation is it unclear how the Philippine Navy would enforce this. It is also unclear how the Chinese will enforce it. Will they rely just on the Coast Guard? Will they use the maritime militia? How will the Philippine Navy be able to be in all those places to be able to keep these types of actions from happening, and how they would step in? So again, a escalation flashpoint that could start as early as next week, as the threat from the Chinese Foreign Ministry goes into effect in June. Now, the other thing that came up during Aten Ito's mission to the Scarborough Shoal is that it spotted pipes in the low tide in Scarborough Shoal. Now, it is unclear what these pipes are used for, but it does appear to be Chinese construction. Now, the Chinese have been trying to push out everybody's that's in the Scarborough Shoal. There are no islands to occupy, so it's just maintaining a maritime presence in the area. And the Chinese have kept basically a constant maritime presence in the area to try to intimidate Philippine government and Philippine fishermen from being in the area. But if the Chinese are doing some type of construction, that is also illegal, because they are not, by international law, allowed to do that in the Philippine EEZ unless there is some type of formal agreement between the two countries. Now, Commodore Trinidad did state that the Philippine government would investigate, which may include sending out ships, aircraft, or they might request satellite support from the U.S. and Japan to get a more of a view of what the Chinese are up to, or if it was the Chinese, but I can't imagine anybody else would be doing this. Also, if they requested satellite support from the U.S. or Japan, it would reduce the likelihood of having a clash in the Scarborough Shoal if the Philippines did not want to clash at this time. So the other thing that came out is this week was China released a tape of a conversation between a Chinese diplomat and a Philippine admiral over, quote, a new model of how to manage issues around the Second Thomas Shoal. Now, this is part of when the issue of the Scarborough Shoal and the water cannon attack came up. The Chinese government accused the Philippines of breaking an informal agreement they had with China. And apparently this is what the Chinese were talking about. So the perceived gentleman's agreement between the Philippines and China is what the Chinese are saying the Philippines broke. It is an attempt to cast the Philippines' international image as duplicitous in its international relations. Again, the Philippines are trying to cast the Chinese in a bad light by recording, cataloging, taking video of what China is doing in the shoals in the West Philippine Sea. This is an attempt to try to turn that media attention away from China's actions and towards Philippines breaking their word in international relations. Now, the Chinese embassy in Manila produced the tape through a wiretap. That is a violation of diplomatic protocols. I'm sure many, probably even most, if not all, embassies probably have some form of wiretaps, but you don't go around and releasing them. That is a violation of diplomatic protocols. And it is also against Philippine law. Now, how does that act out? If it's inside the Chinese embassy, obviously that's Chinese sovereign territory. if it was a taped conversation between a Philippine admiral that was outside of the embassy talking to somebody inside the embassy, and it was recorded, that would be a violation of the Philippine Anti-Wiretapping Act. So the Philippines are currently in a probe of the issue, both including in their Congress and executive. Now, the Philippines deny that even if the conversation was not a product of intimidation, it is not binding, and they are certainly correct in this. The probe that the Philippines are doing is not about the, quote, gentleman's agreement, though they probably are pursuing if somebody spoke out on the Philippine side, spoke out of turn. But the probe focuses on the circumstances surrounding the conversation and not whether the Philippines will concur with the contents of the wiretap. So first off, this is not even unofficial policy of the Philippine government. The claimed agreement had never reached the Philippine government's cabinet level, so it could never become unofficial policy of the Philippine government. It's not official policy because no treaty between the Philippines and China ever included it. So it's not a legally binding agreement. This is just an attempt by the Chinese to embarrass the Philippine government. This is also a breach of Philippine law, again, depending how the conversation broke down. It is a definite violation of diplomatic protocols. And there has been some calls to punish the Chinese embassy up to and including the ambassador's expulsion. So obviously, if they do that, which I don't think they will do it, it would obviously lead to some form of reciprocal expulsion in the Chinese side. So more to come on that. Again, there will be more volumes being written in the West Philippine Sea newsletter. So the events of the past couple of weeks are part of this. Again, I talk about the escalating action-reaction cycle that continues between the two countries. So should the Philippines legitimately expel any Chinese embassy staff, China will likely respond in kind. But the more dangerous issue is the Chinese threat to arrest trespassing foreigners in the South China Sea and the vow of the Philippine government not to allow this to happen. So the president has stated that a Philippine citizen's death at the hands of the Chinese enforcing their illegal claims could trigger the U.S. defense agreement with the Philippines. So that is a danger of if they actually try to press arresting Philippine citizens operating in the West Philippine Sea. Now, Beijing is consternated by the Philippines' strong response to these Chinese threats. China does not want to appear weak because they fear backing down could lead to the collapse of their other illegal claims in the South China Sea. I don't know if that's really legitimate because the Philippines occupy a unique position in that they they're part of the first island chain, which I've talked about before. That makes it difficult for China to reach the Philippines. And also, the Chinese would have to project naval power around the Philippines that has a defense alliance with both the U.S. and one with Japan as well. This is not a war the Chinese want to fight, especially if they want to be serious about taking Taiwan, which are having exercises this week where they've surrounded the island of Taiwan with naval force, which again, remember talking about blockades earlier, it's pretty close to one. So this is not a war that the Chinese want to fight. This is basically all the disadvantages and all the advantages go to the Philippines. However, a war with the Philippines is not a battle the Chinese want to fight now or in the future. So the Philippines maintain a strong position against China and continues to leverage its advantages against larger adversaries that is failing to intimidate the Philippines. The Philippines will maintain the upper hand as long as China is restricted outside of the first island chain. They do not have a significant operational carrier force that can challenge the U.S. or land-based aircraft in the Philippines, which would include most likely U.S. and possibly Japanese aircraft. So again, this is not a war that the Chinese want to fight. So as long as the political will is there within the Philippines, this is not a situation that is favorable to the Chinese. And I think the way the Philippines are playing this, they know that. So again, I've talked about it earlier, and I will go back and say, knowing the being in the Pacific for the time I was, there is no greater friend than the Philippines, and no more worse enemy than the Philippines when you talk about the Philippine people. So we will see how that goes. It gets just a matter of political will. That does not mean that the tensions will not subside, and accidents happen in wartime. So, or when you start to escalate, all it takes is one Philippine person to get killed by some overt action by the Chinese, and things can spin out of control. But as of now, it's just not a war that is in favor of Beijing to fight. So, we'll see if this is a series that people would like me to continue to have. Excuse me.
Playing all songs.
So it's something that I think. Hold on one second. Excuse me, the Amazon Alexa went off, started playing music, so I apologize on that. So we'll see if this West Philippine newsletter is something that we want to see. The results were generally not well received on YouTube. Rumble did okay on Substack, so we'll see how it goes. If it's something that you want to continue to read. There's one interesting comment I saw on YouTube, and I will not mention the person's name. Everybody's allowed to their opinion. It was on Are the Philippines Changing Tactics? That a commenter it looked like from Indonesia, had stated that China is free to... Actually, no, I came from, okay, I don't remember the article, but it was basically stated that China should be free to sell as many weapons as it wants to Russia in its war against Ukraine. Now, I think what they fail to recognize in that is, again, that's an opinion. It is certainly a right, I guess, of China to do so, just as the West is sending weapons to Ukraine. But I think what they fail to mention in that one, that commentary that China should be free to send as many weapons as it would like to Russia in its war, is China still needs access to Western markets. It still needs to sell its goods, and its economy is under a tremendous amount of pressure. So for the Chinese to turn around and sell weapons to Russia, it would isolate the West. It would probably cut off much of its trade with the West, and would deepen the bloc mentality of that's going on in the world, where you have the West and Western aligned countries on one side, and Russia and China and its allies on the other, which are much fewer. But again, Russia has more nuclear weapons than any country in the world. So if China chose to do that, they would obviously bear a huge economic cost by doing so. And how long could their society operate and thrive when it is cut off from trade with the West? So something probably not considered. That's probably why China does not sell weapons. So certainly they wouldn't mind selling weapons to Russia, and I don't think they have a moral qualm with that. It's just a matter that they would lose access to the foreign markets of the West and would have a tremendous impact to their economy and most likely an impact to their social cohesion of their country. So that's why they choose not to do it. They're trying to play both sides of the fence, certainly leaning more towards the Russian side, but they also need the West and its trade, just as Russia needs the West to continue to use energy, and so it needs Russian oil on the market. So just the intertwining of international affairs and economics and trade, even when you see two apparent blocs at war, they still have this strange need for each other. Still questions why we don't find a better way to peace in that conflict. So anyway, that is the more conversations to come, more thoughts on that. If you like my content, please become a subscriber on YouTube, Rumble. More directly, it would help if you were join or follow me on Substack. That helps create my channel gives me some form of legitimacy, that when you have something other than 18 followers, you look like more of an authoritative source. No matter how good my content is, if I do not have a lot of followers, it is harder for me to be viewed as an authoritative source in providing opinions on these matters. So again, any support would be greatly welcome. Interesting thing, I guess this is probably why the West Philippine newsletter was kind of disappointing, is when I looked at my YouTube views, again, there's no exclusive content. Everything is on Substack. But when you look at YouTube, over half of my views come from the Philippines. So I want to thank all the people in the Philippines that have reviewed my content, and the ones that have also commented is very much appreciated. So we will see how it goes if I continue this newsletter, the West Philippine newsletter. Obviously, I'll still continue to write articles on other matters as well. So again, please consider becoming a member or a subscriber, even an unpaid subscriber on Substack. You can support me on Patreon, but you can also become a subscriber on YouTube or on Rumble, locals as well, if you choose to. All those will be in the description section. And again, send me a comment. I read all the comments. Don't reply to a lot of them because I don't have a lot of them. And time is limited, trying to maintain a full job and doing all this content. But I appreciate all the comments. If you have any thoughts, please send my way. I do read everything. And I do appreciate, even when you disagree with me, if you do it respectfully. But even if you don't do it respectfully, I will still read it. So until next week, remember, those in the U.S. is Monday is Memorial Day. Take time to think about the purpose, the reason for the 3-day weekend, the sacrifices that so many people have made, service members in the U.S. have made for this country. So as much as it's nice to have a 3-day weekend and have the beginning of the summer, remember the reason for the holiday and take time to think about all those who gave it all for this country. So to my international audience, I hope you have a great weekend and a good start of your week. And I will talk to you next week. Thank you.